To talk about Philadelphia's hidden heritage. Just by way of introduction, my name is Melissa Stevens. I'm World Heritage Program Manager with Global Philadelphia Association. Do you mind each of you introducing yourselves, just very briefly saying what it is your organization does?
Sure, I'm Twame Forrest. I'm the Executive Director of Historic Germantown. We're a consortium of 18 cultural sites in Northwest Philadelphia.
And I'm Jessica Baumert, the Executive Director of the Woodlands Trust for Historic Preservation. We manage a 54-acre National Historic Landmark District in West Philadelphia.
And I'm Pete Woodall. I'm the Project Director of Hidden City Philadelphia. Hidden City is a public history and journalism organization. We publish the Hidden City Daily, which covers Philadelphia's built environment, and we also offer tours.
Great. So we're going to get into a bit more detail soon about what it is that your organizations do and what kinds of opportunities are available to the public. But really what we're here today to do, as we were talking about before, is to shine a light on Philadelphia's hidden heritage. Global Philadelphia Association, who I work for, we manage the World Heritage City Project with the City of Philadelphia, and one of the goals of that project is to create a more inclusive and representative picture of Philadelphia's heritage. A lot of people know about the Liberty Bell and a couple of those Center City and Old City sites, but really Philadelphia has a wealth of historic and cultural sites that represent a lot of different periods of history, a lot of different significant happenings, events, people, and a lot of different types of communities. And if we really spend some time investigating all of those different aspects of Philadelphia heritage, we realize that we have always been a very diverse city. So that's part of what I want to do here today with you, is to learn more from your experiences and from the sites that you manage and the communities that you work with, to shine a light on the aspects of Philadelphia's heritage that a lot of people in Philadelphia and visitors to Philadelphia aren't really aware of or should be more aware of. So first of all, let's talk a little bit about historic Germantown.
Sure.
So first of all, can you tell me a little bit more about historic Germantown, the sites that you represent, and what kinds of activities and offerings you have for visitors there?
Sure. Historic Germantown, again, as I said, represents sites broadly in Northwest Philadelphia. For us, we take our name from the old German Township, which now encompasses the neighborhoods of Chestnut Hill, Mount Airy, and Germantown. And we have sites in those neighborhoods as well as in adjacent neighborhoods as well. We just added 2 additional sites this year, so we're up to 18. And I think those a couple of those new sites really speak to our interest in broadening the type of stories and history that we present. So the Black Writers Museum joined this year, and they're located in Vernon Park in the old Worcester Mansion. And Supreme Dow is the founder and director of that institution that really showcases the history of Black literature in this country from the early days up to present times. And the Lest We Forget Museum of Slavery, which is actually co-located in our building at 5501 Germantown Avenue, is a unique collection put together by Justin and Gwen Ragsdale over 5 decades of items and documents related to the history of slavery in this country. So a very important story and a unique collection in the city. So those are 2 of the new ones we have. We also have 5 National Historic Landmark properties, which I know you all have been helping highlight and promote those NHL properties through the city. We have a range of others. The only Underground Railroad site that's publicly interpreted in the city, the only Victorian House
one
Museum.
Was that?
That's the Johnson House.
Yep.
And
also a National Historic Landmark.
A National Historic Landmark, doing great programs. So, and we have ones that are well known and others that very few people have visited that really are hidden gems. One of my favorites is the Concord Schoolhouse, which is not a staffed organization, but it's an authentic 19th century schoolhouse that the minute you walk into that building, that one-room schoolhouse, you are transported back in time. It's attached to the upper burial ground, so a cemetery with grave sites of Revolutionary War folks and others. So a fascinating site that even people that pass by it daily really aren't aware of it, don't know a lot about it.
Yeah, what kinds of outreach do you do in the community of Germantown? Do you work with residents and community organizations?
Yes, increasingly. I think certainly we're interested in welcoming visitors and tourists from around the region and around the world, which we do, but a lot of the work that the sites do, and they're all independently run, so it's not a single organization dictating what they do. But the majority of the folks that access these sites are community residents. So a lot of our programs are geared towards educating school kids in the Philadelphia school system, to welcoming neighbors through various festivals and other events, that type of thing. So there are festivals and activities, especially between May and October. Every week there's something going on up in Germantown.
Great. What's one that's coming up, we'll say in the holidays, give us like a month out. What kinds of events are coming up?
Well, one that my organization helps promote is the Historic House Tour on the 27th of October. And that's one where we access private homes and residences, and we do some research, architectural and social research behind that place, so it's educational. This year we're featuring artists' homes and studios, active artists, because the area has a lot of active makers, artists, craftspeople. So it's exciting. So we'll see some traditional houses as well as spaces that have been repurposed for studios or galleries. So that's something fun. Of course, a number of the sites do harvest and Halloween-related activities. Folks that are interested can go on to freedomsbackyard.com. It has a full calendar of activities through the month that they can access.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you. Jessica, the Woodlands is also a National Historic Landmark. Can you tell me a little bit more about the history of the Woodlands and what's available there to visitors?
Yeah, so the Woodlands has a very layered history. It's part of what I think makes it so special. It was the 18th century estate of William Hamilton, who was a man who inherited a lot of land, and he was extremely interested in botanical trade and botany and architecture and art collecting, and he basically created his estate was his life's work. The Woodlands was that estate, so the mansion and stable on the property are both National Historic Landmark buildings since the 1960s, kind of showcasing his architectural prowess. And he also had a massive greenhouse on the property that had 10,000 plant specimens, which is no longer there. However, a lot of introductions of plant species to North America remain on the estate that he made at the Woodlands. So it has this extremely rich botanical history. He dies a bachelor, and the estate is repurposed in the 19th century as a cemetery. The core 90 acres is purchased by Eli K. Price, who was extremely prominent in real estate in the city of Philadelphia, and he also played a huge role in the founding of Philadelphia's Fairmount Park. So it really ties that early rural cemetery movement with the park system in the city. Today we're 54 acres. We're in an extremely vibrant neighborhood. We're kind of sandwiched between the VA hospital and University of the Sciences. University of Pennsylvania is across the street. All of Penn and Drexel's campuses were once part of William Hamilton's estate, so I always like to say they're a part of us. It all started with Hamilton. And we really focus our programming on our direct community as our kind of number one audience. We're the largest open space in the neighborhood. We have over 1,000 trees on the property. It's a great place to learn about different tree species. It's a great place to go on a nature walk. And we have a lot of programs and volunteer opportunities that really work to engage the community in the place.
As a West Philly resident, I walk my dog there a lot.
Yes, we have a lot of dog walkers, runners, and walkers
I go running
in general.
there.
He goes running
Great
there every
place
once
to
in a
run.
while. I see him. So that's really, we've really worked to engage that audience in supporting us and becoming part of our community.
That's great. I like hearing this theme about community engagement, where it's not just outside visitors. You're very much your sites are living heritage sites. You're still a part of the community, not just a place to go and see what the community used to be like.
Right.
You are what the community is like today.
Well, I think it's partially out of necessity because Philadelphia has so many amazing historic sites. But I think it's also what makes living in Philadelphia so special, that we can create these places and we can have our main audience be our community and not necessarily always a tourist that's coming from elsewhere.
Yeah.
And so that to me is what makes, one of the things that makes Philadelphia so special.
Yeah. So, Pete,
Yes.
you don't manage a site, but
No.
you are very knowledgeable, and your organization does a lot of work in promoting these sorts of sites.
Yeah.
So would you like to talk a little bit more about Hidden City?
Sure. Yeah, right. We don't have bricks and mortar, but we do kind of act as a connector between, the greater Philadelphia area and some of these heritage sites. I think we actually wrote an article about Lest We Forget fairly recently, and we also wrote about we've got a tour planned that's going to visit Lest We Forget.
Okay, great.
And I know we've written about Woodlands, here or there. So we do that with the Hidden City Daily, and it's we don't know what to call it exactly. It's kind of like a web magazine, I suppose. We usually publish about 3 full-length reported features a week, and it really runs the gamut. It's plenty of Philly history, but it's also architecture, city planning, and a lot of historic preservation. That's probably our main focus in terms of reporting, in terms of trying to be a watchdog within our resources. So there's that. But then there's the tours. And the tours, many of the early ones especially were led by writers for the Daily. We just kind of tapped their knowledge base. And the focus is really post-colonial Philadelphia history, especially post-Civil War, actually. And neighborhood history, because we're really focused on local residents, regional residents maybe, but not so much tourists coming from elsewhere in the country. And that allows us to get much more specific, in a sense, because we're talking to people who have sort of a body of knowledge. And so, post-Civil War, Philadelphia's history as the workshop of the world, immigrant history, African-American history, and yeah, it's doing great.
Great, thank you. So speaking of all of these different aspects of Philadelphia history and heritage that all of you just touched on a bit, what are some of the things that you think are missing from the dominant narratives about Philadelphia heritage? When you're sitting in school as a student in Philadelphia and you're hearing about the history of your city, or if you're a visitor from out of town, or even if you grew up in Philadelphia and you have a very specific idea of what Philadelphia history and heritage is all about, what do you think is missing from those dominant narratives that most people hear?
Well, I venture one, and I know you may have written about this some, but we don't spend a lot of time talking about the history of the folks that lived here for 10 to 12,000 years before Philadelphia was Philadelphia.
Yes.
The Lenape especially, and that I think is really a missing piece in terms of the official institutions of the city, any a lot of sites or historic markers. I know there's probably some in the school curriculum, but it generally gets short shrift. So I think that's a big piece that's not
totally
taught and talked about a lot, and certainly not to the extent it deserves. Yeah.
Are there any useful resources or opportunities for people in Philadelphia who want to know more about the Lenape and other pre-colonial Philadelphia history?
Well, I know UPenn Museum did a really interesting, groundbreaking exhibit several years ago that still is accessible online that really uncovered a lot of the stories and history that had been present in Pennsylvania but were just never brought to the surface to the mainstream public. And I think that resource, although it's not a physical exhibit anymore, I think is still available. I think there's room in some history institution working with the Lenape peoples in New Jersey and in Pennsylvania to have other places where that story gets told in a way that they would like it to be told. Yeah.
Anybody else? Any other aspects of,
No, that's a great
of
one.
hidden heritage? Yeah, that was. I'm glad that you went all the way back.
Yeah, and I think, being a site that's on the Schuylkill River and Bartram's Garden is just downriver from us, I know that when they do archaeology work, there's a lot of kind of areas identified on the property where, there's a special kind of focus on looking for artifacts that are meaningful to that time period. And we actually have a few spots on the Woodlands too, some of the higher ground areas where, when we hopefully do future archaeology work, we can kind of start to incorporate a little bit more of that into the stories. So.
How about any aspects of Philadelphia heritage represented at the Woodlands that a lot of people don't already know about?
Well, I think that one of the things that is, like, the more I learn about it in Philadelphia is absolutely incredible is the botanical heritage in the whole region. So you had Bartram's Garden. Bartram's Garden, at least in this country, is probably not all that well known outside of Philadelphia, with the exception of a few. But in England, you go to England and everybody knows who John Bartram was because he was so important there in importing North American plants to England. Just downriver, you had the Woodlands. William Hamilton had what was thought to be the most significant greenhouse of the 18th century, with people with botanical interests from all over the world came to the Woodlands in the 18th century. You talk to anyone now and they don't know about it. Between the Woodlands and Bartram's Garden, there was a place called Gray's Gardens. In the 19th century, tons of seed production and seed when the kind of hobby gardener scene started up and people started making seed catalogs. We were the place where those seeds were being imported or exported from, and we also had the first color seed catalogs being made here, and a lot
Beautiful
of those
ones.
people are buried at the Woodlands, those early seed and plant people. So there's this kind of legacy that continues in the horticulture world, and then you have Wick.
Wick, which is again a great analog to those riverfront properties.
Right.
Still the oldest rose garden in the country in original form. You have people, rose fans from all over the country that come to Wick just because of the heritage roses there. And Jellett, who was a botanist in Germantown, and others. So you're right, there was this incredible group of people for a couple centuries who were botanists, amateur and professional, that were known nationally and internationally.
And to this day, you have the Longwood Garden. Think about the kind of today botanical gardens that are in this region, and they're internationally known. And I think it's something as Philadelphians we don't talk about.
We don't
enough.
talk. I mean, this is more your side, but this is why we have the flower show, right?
Yeah.
Essentially,
Right.
I mean, not
Yeah.
directly, but
Yeah.
it was a product of this culture.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So yeah, right. When people think of Philadelphia, botany is not up there, but it should be. Should be.
Pete, I'm interested in your take on this. One of my other thoughts answering your question was, I still don't think Philadelphia gets the credit for its importance in architectural history. I don't think it's a big overstatement to say it's maybe the most important city in the U.S. for the full span of architectural history, and especially really important for 20th century architecture. And the folks in Chicago really take a lot of too much credit, actually, for
Chicago loves to.
for that. And arguably, Philadelphia's 20th century architecture is more important globally than anywhere else in the country.
That's
So
interesting.
it's I'm putting a marker out there. I'm just curious what you think about that.
Well, Chicago shows you what can be done if a city just decides this is what we were great at,
Right.
and really has that self-conception.
Yeah.
I mean, it's certainly even probable that Chicago has the best collection of architecture in the country. But as you said, none of it really predates the fire of 1873?
Yeah.
So that's a pretty limited span when you think that Philadelphia goes back to 1680 roughly, in terms of stuff that's still around. Philadelphia doesn't have to me, Chicago has, to kind of go into a different realm, what they call charismatic megafauna. Chicago has like the tigers and the lions and the giraffes, and we've got more subtle things. And even our great modernist masters like Louis Kahn, the stuff he built in Philadelphia is very hard to love compared to some of the things he built elsewhere, like the Yale Library, or the Salk Institute in California. Those things, when you look at them, you just go, wow, this is genius. This is special. When you look at Richard's Medical Laboratories, which is on this list, you're like, why does everyone think this is so great? And likewise, Robert Venturi with Guildhouse. Guildhouse was recognized very quickly as a work of like a classic almost instantly. And yet I passed it every day for almost 8 years on Spring Garden Street, and I tried and I tried and I tried and I tried.
Like, we're supposed to be pumping this stuff up here. I mean,
well, I'm explaining why it's
it's tough,
but to make the case for it, to me, it's the streetscape as a whole, and the atmosphere it creates, and the way that even in Center City we go from skyscrapers to 19th century residential streets, and then back up to early 20th century commercial streets, and so that's that layering of the different eras, which even in Europe is not as common as you would think. There's wars, there's fires, there's various catastrophes. Like, to me, Naples in Italy has the greatest range of eras, and so Philadelphia shares that, I think. And we have Frank Furness. And so that's our tiger or lion, to me. And he was kind of a tiger. So, and I think PAFA must be on here, right?
Just to create a little more of a visual, this is and a little context too. This is the map of Philadelphia's 67 National Historic Landmarks. The historic landmark designation is basically the highest that you can receive as a historic site from the federal government. So we have 67 of them. There's about 2,500 in the entire United States, and we have 67 just within the boundaries of Philadelphia County. So again, this is this map actually came about because I was looking for a map that would represent the breadth of Philadelphia's heritage, both geographically in its spread, that we are talking about multiple neighborhoods when we talk about Philadelphia heritage, and also just the recognition, the level of recognition. These aren't just sites that are interesting to a specific neighborhood or significant to a significant neighborhood. They have recognized significance to the nation. So we have a lot to be proud of, and we have a lot to showcase. And we've been talking about a couple of the National Historic Landmarks. Your organization works to promote several of them. You directly represent one of them, and you've written and talked about a lot of them. But to go back to the question of what it is that we're missing when we hear about Philadelphia history and heritage. Architecturally, do you have some other?
Well, I mean, now that I'm thinking of it, of course you think of it afterwards, but the PSFS building is the first modern skyscraper in America, and I never get tired of looking at it. It's near my office. I walk down to Market Street and I look at it, and it just looks so fresh and crisp like today, and I love that. But I think the thing that we're really missing is Philadelphia's industrial history. Philadelphia, known as the workshop of the world, pretty much, the vast majority of the city that we know today was built based on that economy, that manufacturing economy. And yet we don't have a museum dedicated solely to that, nor do we have a museum that even deals with it in a peripheral way, which is truly remarkable. We have,
and I think interestingly that also ties into immigrant populations and whole neighborhoods that were developed to support that.
Right.
And so has a lot to do with how our whole city was built.
Right, and
Yeah.
and so then what stories are we missing? You know, it's not just that we don't have the tools in some museum, it's that we don't have those immigrant stories, but even more so, we don't have those worker stories. You know, Philadelphia, you know, had all sorts of ups and downs in its labor and union organizing history, and very, very few people are aware of that history.
Yeah.
Even something as simple as the state of Pennsylvania blue historical markers, which in general Philadelphia does an amazing job with. I think we only have 7 or 8 related to industry in the entire city.
Wow.
And yet we produced as many textiles in 1900 as I believe the entire country of England.
Yeah.
So that's my pet one. I love
Yeah.
industrial history. I just wish we could do more with it.
A couple of things that I'm hearing from all of the responses so far is that possibly it's not just one aspect of Philadelphia heritage that's missing, it's more a better understanding of the whole, of an understanding the significance at more than just a site or neighborhood level. With the National Historic Landmarks, we can talk about each and every one of them and their significance in a national context, but I also keep hearing about these global connections. The interest in, like you were saying, with botany, and the heritage that we have as a city is more than just what we've inherited from past generations that lived here, but also these global interactions that we've been having. And the industrial heritage that you're talking about, and the fact that we were the workplace of the world, we were the ones that were producing so much that was going out globally, and that whole network, that trade network that goes way back before even the Workshop of the World. That's something that continues today, and in establishing the relevance and what it is that's missing from the Philadelphia story, maybe it's that we're a little too insular and focused just on specific neighborhoods or just on specific sites. Do you think it would be more useful to present some of this in a larger, broader context?
I think there's another issue. I mean, it relates to what you were saying. Is, you know, I think post World War II history in Philadelphia is actually really important, and I think part of the issue in terms of a city or region's kind of self-perception, say counterbalanced to the Chicago example, is this narrative of decline. And that all the good stuff happened either in the Industrial Revolution when we were the workshop and we had the jobs, or you know, in the colonial time when we became the capital, whatever it was sometime a long time ago when Philadelphia was important. And certainly it's important to recognize those eras of history, but also recognize, you know, what's been happening in the last 30, 40, 50, 60 years. It's also important locally and nationally. And tying into some of the themes, like, because again, I think if you think of history thematically, you can see the threads, the threads for the kind of search for freedom and equality. Didn't stop, you know, at the Civil War. Didn't stop, you know, in the Civil Rights era.
No.
It's continued
still
up to
happening.
up to today. And I think it's important for
Very good
residents to understand what we're doing now. That's important. Has a direct connection to the social and material history that's all around us.
Yeah, when we're talking about Philadelphia's heritage and
Right.
our historical sites, we're not talking about who we were, we're talking about who we are.
Right.
So,
Right.
yeah. Anybody have any other thoughts right now about some of the aspects of Philadelphia heritage and history that you think are missing? Something else that you would like to shine a light on? What's a favorite site of yours that most people would walk right by?
So
Pete's
many.
gonna come
Yeah.
with a lot of them.
Yeah, I've got a lot of them. I would, but you know, I think Church the Advocate has got to be way up there for me. I was happy to see it on this list because you know, I'm more looking for whether it's just on the Federal Register for our work. You know, trying to think, are they going to get tax credits to redevelop this? And I don't necessarily think about what the national historic landmarks are. So this list actually was broader in scope than I would have thought. I love that the Wagner Institute is on there, which is just a little
That's one of my favorites.
gem of science from the 19th century that's really unchanged for the last, what is it now, 150 years almost, 140 years. You're basically looking at what they thought people should know about 140 years ago. So that's pretty amazing.
And that's another story that I feel like we don't tell enough. We've got
the natural
medical,
history.
like just science
Science.
history in general.
Science.
You know, during the Civil War, this is where doctors, both from the North and the South, were trained because this was the best place to get your medical training, and that's when all the advances were made. And a lot of those doctors are buried at the Woodlands. But it is a huge part of our history, and it's something we don't talk about a lot.
And it's a big part of who we are today, and that's what we've inherited. And the Wagner is a really great representation of that, because it has, like, now we can say, and I hear a lot that we're now becoming a city of eds and med, or we are a city of eds and med. Wagner does a really good job of presenting how that has always been a part of the fabric of Philadelphia. Wagner Free Institute of Science, it's called the Free Institute of Science because it was at the forefront of public science education when it was radical to actually present the specimens that are on display to the public and have it free and have educational programs and lectures, and that sort of public education was not happening at the time, and they were instrumental in starting that movement, and they continue that today. It continues to be free. They continue to have free open lectures, and it's also an interesting tie into Philadelphia's medical heritage and science education in general. So I feel like we have so many sites like that can be directly tied into things that Philadelphia are really well known for today, like we were just talking about with the flower show.
And I think, per our earlier comments, sites that are historically recognized but are also doing work now that relates to the history but relates to contemporary society. You mentioned Church of the Advocate, and it's on the register or is an NHL because of its incredible architectural specimen. It's a French Gothic cathedral in North Philadelphia, but arguably its most important contributions to history really happened in the 60s and 70s, when it was a center of the civil rights movement and became the first place to ordain women within the Episcopal Church, doing so illegally. So really, some kind of social action is probably its lasting legacy, not just to Philadelphia, but to the nation. And I think historic sites that are really conscious of that and engaged with it are, like what Eastern State Penitentiary is doing more recently around not just showcasing a historic prison, but really starting to advocate, for prison reform. Step that a lot of historic sites don't take, but it's an important one to think about, is using that history in a way to engage with contemporary issues.
I think that's a great example. And actually that was one of the questions that I was going to pose, and you just led right into it so beautifully. What are some of the things that historic sites can be doing to communicate relevance to modern audiences? So talking about, like we were saying, not just who we were and what happened, but who we are today and the connection.
So you want to take that?
I look at the different types of programming we've done at the Woodlands, and everything that has been the most successful are programs that people can find relevance in their own life. And Eastern State is an amazing example. The Wagner is an amazing example because they're still doing what they've always done, but their lectures are on contemporary issues. They're rarely on history-related issues. And one of the things that I realized quickly after stepping into my role at the Woodlands is not everybody cares about history or realizes that they care about history. But that doesn't mean that this National Historic Landmark can't be a special place to them. And there are so many different ways to kind of get people intrigued. And one of the things that we try to do is, if there's a big event happening in Philadelphia, if the car shows here. The inventor of the electric car is buried at the Woodlands. The electric car was actually invented in the early 20th century.
Oh,
really? And
is it Frank?
His name is escaping me right
Schumann?
now.
No.
now.
No.
Damn. Anyway, the inventor of the electric car is buried at the Woodlands. So we did a blog post on him and put it out there, kind of tying in this new car show that's happening
Yeah.
to spotlight all the new cars and to say like, hey, this electric car thing's been around a long time. Or, you know, similarly during an election, Mary Grew's buried at the Woodlands, and we have, you know, she was an abolitionist and a suffragist, and she was never able to vote. So, you know, to try to highlight some of the stories of people that are long gone, who we can then use to tie in what is happening today. And we've found that that really resonates with people. You know, also just making this space open and available and seem like it's not intimidating. So many people are often like, oh, it's a museum. Or for me, it's a cemetery. Should I go in the gates? Can I go explore?
Yeah.
I grew up in West Philly,
Yeah.
and I never went inside. Never even occurred to me that I would want to go inside. Nor for my friends either. Everyone was like, "There's a creepy mansion in there," and that's about all anyone knew.
Yeah,
This
I think
is
I
like
was
the
just a
80s,
morbid
like-
kid, so I was all about cemeteries.
Well, and now it's a major neighborhood amenity.
Yeah.
Right,
I've
Yeah,
lived in West
it's a
Philadelphia
whole-
for 16 years. It's one of the most important places in the neighborhood for a lot of people.
It's a community space now.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so making that transition in people's head from it's a kind of historic site that I have to be really precious and careful with to it's a place that is for me
Yeah. Yeah.
through different programs. And I think that a lot of sites are doing that sort of thing. A lot of historic Germantown
Oh,
sites
absolutely.
are doing.
Yeah. I think it's a balance. I don't think there's one formula for this, because most of the sites that are active are trying to do things that are educational and maybe a little more serious. They're trying to do things that are fun and bring people in that normally wouldn't be on that place, whether it's, you know, a thing with food and drink or entertainment. And they're trying to be relevant to their neighbors and to a wider world. So it's really doing a variety of things. But you know, again, I think the ones that are embracing an aspect of their history that relates to the present day and making that connection more. You know, Johnson House and our consortium really, you know, takes very seriously its legacy related to the Underground Railroad, and most of their programming has something to do with contemporary issues around the fight for equality and freedom and justice, and that's, you know, something they take very seriously. And I think again, more of the sites that can do that, and there are different ways to do that.
Yeah.
It doesn't all have to be lectures or tours. It can be festivals and events and training programs and a whole range of things. Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah. Pete, with your tours and other programming that Hidden City presents to the public, what are some of the more popular tours and articles that have gotten the most traction and comments and interest? And what do you think that says about what Philadelphians get really excited about when it comes to Philadelphia history?
It's funny you ask. Well, anything about cemeteries or anything that is underground. Those are the two things that people
Your underground tour is always sold out.
always sold out,
Yep.
subterranean. And really it's more of a, I mean, it's a transit history tour in essence. We just happen to be underground as a way of telling it. And we do see lots of different things underground when you're actually down there and not having to run for the trolley and you're actually just trying to notice everything around you. It feels very different. But we have a Mount Moriah Cemetery tour, and that's in Southwest Philly. It's a part of Philly that most people don't get to very often, if ever, unless they live nearby. It's another place that's become a community space. Recently, I actually had to change our copy where we describe the tour, and instead of saying it's like abandoned and overgrown, I now say it's part of a fascinating transformation, which isn't complete yet, but it's in process.
Yeah. I see family picnics there and
Yes.
family barbecues and events
Yes.
there. all the
There's a
time, yeah.
native plant group there. There's all sorts of things going on there. All of a sudden, there was just a real untapped desire amongst a lot of people for that. So West Philly is like an embarrassment of riches. Really,
Yeah.
seriously.
The
I mean,
whole city is. I mean, this
Yeah.
is the thing.
Yeah.
I mean, back to your what's your favorite site in Philly? My favorite thing to do in Philly is just to walk around and look up, and the remnants of like all of our hundreds of years of history can be seen on the buildings that still remain. And so I think one of the things that kind of as a city, thinking about how every neighborhood is important and the buildings in that neighborhood played an important part, and looking up and being able to see that old sign is actually really important for context of all of our history, and a little bit more focus on that as citizens is something that I think could go a long way into kind of protecting what a special place Philadelphia is, and that whole story.
Yeah.
And I
Looking
think-
up. I
Yeah.
keep
Yeah,
hearing you all say, when I look up. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's not your habit as a pedestrian on a sidewalk to glance up the second, third, fourth story. It's where a lot of the story of the building is told. You know, I think there's something, I'm sure you see this a lot in your writing and reporting, there's a lot of concern in Philadelphia about the pace of development and what we're losing, how we're losing it, what the process is, what the role of neighbors and citizens is in that. And I think that's all over most neighborhoods. And not every neighborhood is going through the same changes at the same pace, but it's certainly something that you know, we see a lot in Germantown. I know West Philly is experiencing it. Yeah.
And I think if there's not development pressure, then there's often, for a lot of important places, demolition by neglect.
Right,
And
yes,
so,
yeah.
or sites that, you know, we all have resource issues.
Right, right.
And when you have this many historic sites in a city, the city alone can't necessarily help support all of that. And when we live in a city that has so much poverty, that it's not like we have a huge amount of people giving money to these places when we have other problems to deal with. So looking at places like the John Coltrane House, which I know that there's a kind of focus being put on now by Faye Anderson, who is a preservation activist who's doing a lot of great work for sites relevant to jazz history, which is her thing, and also to African American history in the city that has been kind of gone unnoticed or hasn't had a light shown on it in the way it should. So thinking about places like that are really kind of demolition by neglect / resource issues, but really important places, and figuring out how we as a city can come together to make sure that those places are saved and protected.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on the preservation, developments?
it's just the speed. I think people are really struggling with how fast it's happening. You know, it didn't happen at all for 50 years.
Yeah.
And then we had like a little push in like 2004, 5, 6, 7. And then, you know, we hit the recession and it kind of scaled back and it seemed more livable. And now all of a sudden it's like bulldozers everywhere up in Brewerytown, in Kensington, in parts of Powelton certainly, and mostly all of South Philadelphia it seems like. But without development pressure, you don't have the money to restore an old building that's been allowed to crumble for a very long time. I mean, that's what laws are for, right? I mean, you can't ask the conscience of each individual developer to be, you know, you can't appeal to that. I mean, I know some ethical developers, they're wonderful people, but they're exceptions to the rule. So, you know, Philadelphia basically, we were down so long that, you know, we became desperate for any development. And we didn't have the self-confidence as a city to expect developers to do things in a certain way. We said, you're ready to do it? Great, we're ready to have you. It doesn't matter what you're doing. And now I hope we will finally get that confidence where we say this is the way we want the development to happen. There's some structural power issues that are kind of preventing that, in addition to like metaphorical confidence issues. But And that's really, I think, what's holding things back. But I'm hoping, next administration, because a lot of it really is centered in the mayor's office, frankly. But we don't need to go too far down that road.
I will ask, not going too far down that road, but do you think the Preservation Task Force is a step in the right direction? And the report that came out of that, I don't know if, I assume you're familiar with that?
Oh yeah, very much so. Very much so. Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
a lot of the recommendations being made are good ones and a step in the right direction. It's still going to take political will in order to enforce any of it. None of it is law at this point, and so without some political will, I think that we'll see what happens with it. There are a few bills right now that are being presented in City Council that are kind of promising, but it's going to be baby steps. And one of the things that I know Pete and I have talked about before is demolition delay. So if someone applies for a demolition permit, giving the city time to review that place and make sure that it's a place that we're okay with being torn down.
Yeah. And the delay is a part of one of the bills that's being considered now?
It's not. It's
okay,
not.
that's one of the recommendations that hasn't
It is a
been considered.
recommendation.
yeah.
Yeah.
So, and that a lot of cities have that in place, and it would help make sure that we're not making a huge mistake that we will regret, which I think we've made a handful of in the past several years. So.
Yeah. I mean, I think in essence we have to make it economically more attractive to
Right.
preserve than to tear down.
Yes.
And that's the
Absolutely.
basic formula flip that has to happen, because if you make it economically more sense for a developer to tear down, that's what's going to happen. And just, I mean, 9 times out of 10.
That is it.
It's fairly simple.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's
Yeah.
100%.
Definitely.
But I think the larger question, this is I think especially germane to Germantown, is concerns about equity also, in keeping equity within the community and wealth and jobs, and I think that's part of the concern of gentrification is not simply a building disappearing and a new one being built in its place, but what is kind of the social dislocation that's happening, and it does relate to pace, but it relates to kind of real issues of equity in terms of race and class that I don't think that the heritage community is really addressed head on fully or effectively. Yeah.
It's a tough one.
It's a tough one.
Yeah.
I mean,
Tough one.
it's a tough one, but it's at least it's tougher if you try and ignore it as an issue than actually say it is an issue.
No. I mean, I think we'd all be a little. I think I think everyone wouldn't be quite so up in arms if what they built was a little more attractive and a little bit more to scale.
Right.
Like, it kind of adds insult to injury
All right.
when you not only tear down the building that you really enjoyed walking by every day, but you build in its place something that looks like junk.
Right.
And I think most people in their communities, when that happens, most of the time think, who is this being built for? This is not being built for me.
Right.
Or this is not being built for my neighbor. This is being built for someone new. So thinking about how that plays into the whole thing. And then you see churches being torn down that are, even if they are no longer being used as churches, or if they're shuttered, they're still visual anchors in communities that I think are really important. And as we lose those spires, the just general kind of feel of the communities are changing significantly, and figuring out creative ways to reuse churches
Right.
Yes.
be a great thing for Philadelphia to really get good at.
So I think
You know everything about that.
I've dealt with that for a few years. But so I do think there is a strong sense at the grassroots neighborhood level of an interest in history and in preservation. It doesn't always manifest itself by people going on a tour at a museum, and there are a lot of reasons for that. Maybe the tour is not that good, maybe it's not that welcoming, but I think there is a real kind of grassroots interest and concern, and most Philadelphia, most neighborhoods in Philadelphia from most residents about this issue. So again, I think that's an invitation and a challenge to the heritage community. It's
Right.
I don't think we have to create interest. We have to meet that interest where it is and figure out how to
I
to
agree
tap
with that.
into it.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
a really good point.
We're headed in, the goal is kind of the same, just
Yeah.
coming at it from two different
Right.
directions.
Right.
But
Right.
So what are some of the ways that you could see the heritage community and then the residential community coming together with the same goal in mind, whether it be preserving a specific building or just the general character of the neighborhood?
Well, I think the more that the history heritage community can support local businesses, local residents, hire local folks. I mean, make it clear that what you're doing has a real tangible benefit to people in a pocketbook sense. I think is helpful, and I actually think there's a lot of power, especially collectively, with heritage and history sites. I mean, not a single site can hire a ton of people or support a lot of local businesses, although it can. But collectively, if we look at it, that can happen. I also think, because most of these are place-based organizations, that opening up and allowing that space as community space, the way that many churches and religious organizations do, that we can be part of that and saying this is, this space is where community can happen, and we don't have, if you want to have a wedding here, maybe we'll charge for that. But if it's a community activity,
Yeah.
we won't charge.
Yeah.
And that type of thing really builds a sense of community.
That goes back to what you were just saying
Yeah.
about places that are being built,
Right.
how residents are saying, well, that's not for me, that's for somebody else.
Right.
Existing sites, if that's part of what you're trying to do with the site, is to be there for the community rather than for this idea of an audience, which is obviously always going to be a part of it because you have various audiences that you're trying to attract. But an important part of that is definitely the residents
Right.
around you, the community around you that you're a part of. And I see a lot of sites doing that really well. So we only have about a minute or two left. Any parting thoughts? Actually, let's all say one parting thought that you would like Philadelphia to think about when they think about Philadelphia's hidden heritage. Start with you.
I would just, a little personal challenge, and I think find one place you haven't visited and visit it in the next
Yeah.
year. And it's simple as that. And, go onto any number of websites. And I'm as guilty of this as anyone else. So
Yeah.
there are many great places I have not yet visited. So I'll take that pledge. I'll visit a place I haven't visited, by the end of the year.
Okay.
Yeah.
I would say think of your kind of favorite 3 buildings in your community and in your neighborhood and go on the city's directory of locally protected buildings and find out if they are potentially at risk. And if they are at risk, think about working with someone to make a nomination to protect them if they're a place, or work with your community members to nominate those buildings to prevent demolition.
Yeah, and
That's what I would do, because you'd be
Yeah.
surprised at how many places you assume are protected are not protected.
And the Preservation Alliance of Greater Philadelphia is a great resource if you're interested in doing
Yep.
that.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Well, 2 really quick. One, reestablish the Philadelphia History Museum in some
Yes.
way, shape, or form.
Yep.
And 2, just a variation on Twami's. Just treat your own city as if you were from out of town. Just think of it. Change your perspective a little bit.
Yeah.
And you don't have to use the word tourist. That's kind of icky, but just to see it with fresh eyes and see some place you haven't been before.
Thank you all for contributing your thoughts and all of the great information and advice that you shared. I know that I learned a lot today, and I know that anybody who's going to be paying attention to this conversation is going to walk away with a lot of great things to look up and do and see. So thank you for shining a light on Philadelphia's hidden heritage.